بشمعكن بعوني لدعيتك عينني بشمعكن بعوني لدعيتك عينني لدعيتك نصب الليل عينني بالباكري لدعيتك نصب الليل عينني بالباكري لدعيتك نصب.
Shalom. Our Torah portion for this week is Tavo. At the very beginning of the Sedra, our ancestors are commanded to bring some of the first fruit that they will harvest in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. They are to bring some of this first harvest to a place designated by God. And as they give this offering of the first harvest to the priests who will be officiating there, they are required to say the following, quote, I acknowledge this day before the Eternal your God that I have entered the land that the Eternal swore to my fathers to assign us. And then they were required to state a formula that begins with the following words, Arami Oved Avi. My father was a fugitive Aramean, ending with the acclamation, the Eternal freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, an awesome power, and by signs and portents, bringing us to this place, to this land flowing with milk and honey. Now, these words should sound familiar to anyone who has participated in a Passover Seder. What this declaration amounts to, that we say in this week's Torah portion and also at a Passover Seder, is a recognition that God had fulfilled the divine promise to free our people from bondage and had brought us to the land of Israel. But what Tavo is perhaps most famous for is a long list of curses and blessings which begin with chapter 27 and continue almost to the end of the Sedra. In some communities, the person designated to read these curses during the Torah service is not called to the bima by name. Heaven forbid that his name should be associated with these curses. And that person is required to read those curses very quickly and quietly in an undertone. These curses and blessings were to be announced to the people in a ceremony that took place in a valley between two mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, south of the city of Shechem on what is now called the West Bank. And even though these mountains are in the same geographical area, they couldn't be any different from each other. Mount Gerizim, to this day, is lush and it's green, as it was back then. And Mount Ebal hasn't changed one iota in 3,000 years, is still barren and brown. According to the Torah, according to our tradition, Mount Gerizim represents the blessings that are promised to those who follow in the ways of God. And Mount Ebal represents the curses to those who do not. So what do we learn from this interesting passage about Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal? What do we learn about curses and blessings? We learn that circumstances do not entirely determine whether our lives are filled with blessings or curses. Two people can experience the exact same event. One come away from it blessed, and the other one cursed. Some people have every material advantage in life, and yet they live miserable lives. And then there are some people who are joyous and grateful with very few material possessions. There is a story about two brothers. They were both rabbis. They lived in a town in Eastern Europe. One was extremely successful. He was wealthy and famous, and he had many followers. The other brother had never really amounted to anything in a material sense. He was a pious Jew, certainly a good man, learned, but he had never really had been successful in a traditional sense of the word. Now, the brother who was successful was teaching a shiur, a Torah lesson, one day, and he was teaching his students that they must be grateful when things are good, that you must thank God and praise God when things are going well, and you must also praise God when things are perhaps not going so well. Well, one of his students put up his hand and said, "Rabbi, I understand blessing God when things are going well, but how can you bless God when life is difficult?" Well, the rabbi thought for a moment and he said, that's a question that I really can't answer you. You see, I've had a fairly easy life. My life is full of blessings. But my brother has had a hard life, and yet he still manages to praise God. Why don't you talk to him? He is probably in the synagogue right now. And so the student picked himself up and went to the synagogue, and he found the brother who was not very rich, who was actually very poor. There he was, warming his hands over the stove in the synagogue, eating a meager meal. And the student approached him and said, we were studying with your brother, and I asked him, how can a person praise God when that person doesn't feel God's blessings? And the poor brother looked at the student and he said, you're going to have to ask someone else, because my life is very blessed. And what do we learn from this? Blessings and curses are not determined entirely by circumstances, but by our relationship with God and the way that we live our lives. I hope you'll read this week's Torah portion and come to your own conclusions. Shabbat Shalom.
Searching for